Okay, I think why don't we make a start, Derek? Can I thank everyone for joining us? Can I thank members of the media who have taken the opportunity to be with us today and ask Derek some questions? My thank you to Derek as well for joining us. This is just to remind you that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be available for you to download in the Media Lounge if you'd like to. You're obviously welcome to record this session yourself, and if you have the ability to do so, we advise you to start recording now. If you would like to ask Derek a question, you can submit one in the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, where it says "Ask a question." You can do that whenever you like. Derek's going to give you some slides, a presentation he's going to take you through. And if you want to just start typing questions there, that's fine. Just remember to hit send, otherwise we won't see them. I'll then field those questions to Derek once he's gone through his deck. We're delighted to have Derek back with us. He first talked about the transition index 2 years ago when we were in London. He was just reminding me we were at the Rosewood Hotel for GTNF 2018. We're obviously having to do it virtual this year for all the obvious reasons, but it's our pleasure to welcome Derek back, and I'm going to throw the floor open to him to make his opening remarks. And Derek, if you're ready, I can get the slide deck up for you.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks, and welcome to you all in this very interesting virtual environment. Sound all right? Can you hear me all right on the sound?
Yep, we can hear you.
So, in fact, it was 3 years ago, almost to the day, that we launched the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World at a GTNF meeting. Not surprising, we reserved some of our most important statements for it. And at the time, I think there was a lot of promise that we would start seeing accelerated action on harm reduction products. There was sense that there were a couple of companies starting to do things, but we weren't sure who was doing what and where they were going. 3 years later, we are really pleased to give you the first results of a major focus on this. Let me just remind people that the mission of the Foundation is to end smoking in this generation, and to remind you, perhaps as importantly, that there are 8 million people who die because of the use of tobacco every year, and 1.3 billion users of tobacco. Our work focuses on trying to particularly focus on adult smokers, getting them to quit, to switch to reduced risk products, since we know that those two factors will actually save lives the fastest in the shortest possible time. We also address agricultural issues, and I won't go into those at this stage. I think many of you covering this area understand very well the global tobacco epidemic, and I won't go into details. A couple of key points to think of as we start going through the index are that 80% of all the smokers live in low middle income countries. And some of the smoking rates in some of these countries are extremely high, well in excess of 65% in men in Indonesia, for example, about 50% in men in China, compared to under 20% in many of the OECD countries. The estimates are that almost 1 billion people could die this century if the current trends continue. Part of our sense for doing the work, and in fact spearheading the Foundation, was that the level of ambition about tobacco control, I felt, and many colleagues felt, was far too slow. We still are projecting, WHO is projecting that it'll be many, many decades before the smoking rate goes down. And even more than that, many more decades beyond that, before the death rates will start showing a perceptible decline. Here you can see the status quo expected declines in the average cigarette consumptions in terms of sales, going down from where we are today, 2019, slowly and steadily on the pink line by the 2050s. We believe we should be far more ambitious in aiming for the green line, basically ending the sale of combustible cigarettes in a time period that is possible and can make sense. To remind those who may not know, but I was involved in the development of the Framework Convention at WHO, which still provides the guiding regulatory framework for approaching tobacco control. At the time, we defined tobacco control as including harm reduction. Very important to remember this, because we will see that as things have played out, WHO has not been supportive or moved the support for research and development into the reduced risk category at exactly the same time as the evidence and the science showing the relative risks of a range of products that either didn't exist 10, 20 years ago, or was accelerated in their use by combustible smoker users or toxic non-smoke users. So if on this graphic, you can see that the relative risk is a comparison between the product, which may be a combustible, like a cigar, or it may be a reduced risk product, like snus, against the risk of using a combustible cigarette, knowing that that is the most toxic of the tobacco products on the market. So they have a score of 100. A score of 41 means that cigars are less damaging, but still extremely hazardous. And then you go into the pink category of the reduced risk products. Heated tobacco products and snus have a dramatically lower reduced risk, and nicotine replacement therapy in e-cigarettes are almost imperceptibly different in terms of their risk profile from not actually being a smoker. This is very important because the underlying philosophy we believe that the regulators should follow is to ensure that you're regulating proportionate to the risk associated with health. That is generally not the case. Let me move on to say that what we've seen is that the activities of companies over the last few years have led to an explosion of innovation in the area of cleaner forms of nicotine delivery. And remember that it's not nicotine that is the problem, it's the other stuff. If we can take out the tar and many of the other toxic components of cigarettes or smokeless products, we will and we should be reducing the death rates considerably. In this presentation, I will not be dealing with the fact that there are a large number, a myriad of smaller e-cigarette companies that are out there, and there are a large number of users who may not be using a product made by a major multinational or tobacco company, but there are many tens of millions of users of e-cigarettes. So let me go back to the whole purpose of of what we were trying to do in addressing the long-term impact and changes going on in tobacco companies. Before then, just a caveat. You will have heard, hopefully earlier today, that Daniel Milan presented this very important review, which makes the point that 50% of the global combustible cigarette market is controlled by governments that claim a commitment to the Framework Convention, but actually none of them have any major focus or minor focus on harm reduction that is being published and is out there. This is very important because when we look at the results of the index, we will see that the clustering of what we might call the slowest movers or the laggards is heavily concentrated in state monopolies. Move on. We felt that while the government's approach to regulation was essential and will always be the overall framework for action, companies need to respond and use new technology. That's how we're seeing change happening in areas like the internal combustion engine, where it's being innovators in the private sector who first put out electric cars on the market, others then follow, or those who start with solar power and others follow. The same we've seen here in the case of reduced risk products. Corporate innovation in R&D through technology disruption has created the opportunity for companies to no longer be stuck on their combustible portfolio and move off it. We believe that the index is incredibly important to accelerate the transformation of the global industry. And it really assesses the tobacco companies' activities regarding, are they phasing out high-risk tobacco products? Are they developing reduced risk alternatives to support users to move away from those products? Are they preventing access and marketing of such alternatives to non-smokers and non-users of high-risk products, especially youth? We know that, particularly in the US, we have seen that the concerns about youth, rightly or wrongly, have led to almost a collapse of the reduced risk market, particularly e-cigarettes, depriving adult smokers who seek to actually reduce their risk. Is there a way of ensuring consistency of tobacco harm reduction across all markets within the regulatory guidelines? Before moving ahead to actually look at the specific way in which the index would be constructed, a team spent a lot of time consulting with the widest range of stakeholders, and this is the report of it, from around the world. The stakeholders included all of those with a material interest in the outcome, reducing the risk. So clearly the tobacco user comes first. Government, a huge interest. The tobacco companies and the related companies, academia and research, activists on both sides, activists either supporting the rights of smokers to find healthier, less risky products, and activists who would be opposing this for a range of reasons. And very importantly, the investment community, particularly those with large institutional investments in the multinationals and the tobacco companies. The index was built, I believe, in a very unbiased and transparent approach. And while the foundation funded the initiative, we stood back from the work which was really led by Euromonitor International, who looked at the analytic and the quantitative aspects of the data that would be collected, sustainability, who've really led many companies to address their long-term sustainable future. They examined particularly the question of transparency, the voice of people, the voice of stakeholders, and an independent advisory panel that provided strategic advice and comment on the overall process and comes with a deep insight from the worlds of investing. All of the details of the three are on the website, and I would urge that you look at them should you want them. So the index concept is really very simple. Could we rank the world's 15 largest tobacco companies, which account for 90% of global cigarette volume, in terms of 6 key areas: strategy and management, product sales, capital allocation, product offer, marketing, lobbying, and advocacy? So just to mention one or two, clearly one of the questions we were interested in is around capital allocation to research and development. One would presume that if a company is serious about change, you would see the amount of money they're putting into R&D for reduced risk products would actually be going up very fast and would probably precede what you'd see in the market. By contrast, you'd hope that the amount of marketing dollars being spent on marketing products in low middle income countries of the traditional high risk products would be starting to go down. A lot of the ideas were built upon concepts that were developed in the Access to Nutrition Index, which ranks the top food companies around the world, and the Access to Medicines Index, which has an approach to actually rank the top pharmaceutical companies in terms of how they're providing better access and safety and needed drugs, particularly the developing world. We hope that they were designed to have impact, and I'll go into some of the key headline insights. Overall, industry progress on tobacco harm reduction is extremely limited. And we will give you the data that overall about 3 to 4% of all tobacco products sold today are in the reduced risk category. We will note that some companies have made public commitments, but none have really shifted their focus enough to ensure the true accelerated decline of high-risk products. Most companies have not made any commitment to harm reduction, and you'll see which ones those are. We believe that the focus has been in higher income countries, and remember the statement earlier that 80% of the smokers live in low middle income countries. Most of the progress, in fact, all of the progress, is being made by the most publicly traded multinationals, private and particularly the state-owned companies lagging behind. I would give a caveat before we actually look at the data. That is to say that, of course, the background of all of this is against a reality of a very hostile external environment where there are millions of dollars explicitly aimed at trying to thwart the introduction of laws to allow reduced risk products. And in fact, there are some NGOs whose campaigning approach is to ensure that low middle income countries do not address, and in fact, they ban all forms of reduced risk products. Or, as you know, if you're coming from Europe, some of them are banned. So snus is banned across the European Union. I mention that because progress, of course, by an individual company against the asserted opposition of NGOs and governments means that whatever progress is being achieved is often being achieved despite a hostile regulatory environment and an extremely hostile advocacy environment in many respects. So if you look at the slide, you will see that the ranking using the total ranking of those 6 categories, Swedish Match at the top, followed by Philip Morris International, British American Tobacco, Altria, Imperial Brands, Japan Tobacco, and the Korean Tobacco Company. If we go further, the devil is, of course, in the details. And if you look at this slide, you'll see that there really are 3 groups of companies. There are 2, Swedish Match and Philip Morris International, who are starting to make major progress on having a high proportion of net sales of reduced risk products relative to their high risk products by company. Swedish Match at 44%, and remember that it's predominantly a smokeless tobacco company now. Snus, Zyn, many of those products. Philip Morris, predominantly a combustible cigarette company, with 19%. Those 2 stand out against the next bunch, which are British American Tobacco, Korea, Imperial, and Japan, where between 3 and 5% of their total sales are in reduced risk products. And then you go to the rest. And as I said earlier, look particularly at the China National Tobacco Corporation, which accounts for 44% of all worldwide combustible cigarettes sold, 44%, or the Tobacco Authority of Thailand, or the Vietnam National Tobacco Corporation, all 3 of which the government has 100% ownership in their company. There are others like ITC, where the government has a smaller ownership, around 24%, and Japan Tobacco as well, and has obviously a significant interest. If we look at the tobacco total capital and R&D investments, you'll see that the picture is starting to suggest that while we haven't got the volumes today, certainly the investments is there suggesting that over the next few years, that picture may change quite fast and could change fast if we had a more supportive regulatory environment. So Swedish Match and Philip Morris, along with British American Tobacco, have clearly invested substantially in the R&D for transformation. And you can see that the proportion of their total capital and R&D investments is extremely high. In the middle, we have Altria, Imperial, and the Korean, with the Japanese coming up fairly fast, suggesting that as a second group, they are starting to actually look to the front runners and try to make the changes possible. We know that among companies there's a highly competitive spirit. And if the front runners start actually achieving the profitability and the reach and the scope, it's very likely that the others will start wanting to do what they're doing and emulate it to both achieve the same level of profitability and the same scale that is being achieved. That's the whole purpose of putting this data out in this very transparent way. And then again, look to the laggard countries, the same group that we've spoken about before, predominantly state-based monopolies. If we look at the total amount invested in marketing for reduced and high-risk products, we can see that a similar picture, some significant change evident in that the marketing dollars are moving behind the reduced risk products in the companies where we're starting to see the best results. This, of course, is good news, and we hope that it'll accelerate and translate into greater volumes of combustible smokers moving out of their products. But again, there are regulatory hurdles they face. And as with the other slides, the state monopolies are the laggards on this list as well. What this slide doesn't show, though, is still a continuing need for transformation. And that is that when we looked at the mergers and acquisition over the last few years, most of the mergers and acquisitions by almost all of the companies have been with traditional high-risk tobacco companies. And we haven't yet seen major mergers and acquisitions occurring, which are going to help change the risk profile of the company significantly. That, again, is something to watch for over the next few years. In summary, we believe that the index provides quantitative evidence that is transparently collected, that allows you to have a comparison between each of the companies. If you're asking the question, which ones are seriously transforming to take advantage of technology disruption, the results are here. I would say that we're early stage still of the process. We would hope that in 2 years' time, when we come back and repeat this, we will actually have seen much more dramatic changes. But that change will require not just the deep commitment of companies, but it will take the commitment of governments to remove the hurdles that they are placing in the way of innovation and lowering the death rates. If we had some harmonization between the goals that government and WHO set and the tobacco industry, I believe that the goal of ending smoking over the next few decades is eminently feasible, since the technology is there, the consumers are voting to switch out of their toxic products, and the companies have shown that they're able to innovate and generate the products required. Thanks, and I look forward to any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Derek, for that comprehensive presentation. We'll just go back to camera mode. As I said before at the start of the presentation, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by submitting it into the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side where it says ask a question. Type it in there, and please don't forget to press the send button, otherwise we won't be able to see it. We've got a question from Jennifer from the Wall Street Journal, where she says, it looks like the index doesn't reflect Altria's investment in Juul. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And in one of the earlier slides, I indicate the total number of users of e-cigarettes that will include Juul, probably in the range of 40 to 50 million. It doesn't include that.
Thank you. You're more than welcome to come back with a supplementary on that if you'd like to, Jennifer. In the meantime, let's go to Keith Hughes. Are you finding evidence that the tobacco companies are making moves to change their performance on marketing to youth and uninitiated audiences?
Yeah, I think there are many elements to that. I think in some parts of the world, let's start in the US, I think the progress on the banning of sales of cigarettes and vaping products to kids under 21 was something interestingly supported by many tobacco companies, as well as obviously the government and the regulators. I would say that when we're looking at low middle income countries, it's still a mixed bag. And certainly the report documents that there are many parts of the world where tobacco companies are still continuing to market to youth. Part of the problem has been that we haven't had the transparency on the ground documenting who is doing what with what brands, with what effect in what markets. I believe that's needed, and we need to have a far sharper focus of shining a spotlight on where companies are making statements about a commitment to reduce risk overall, but continuing with practices of marketing to kids, particularly low middle income countries.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Well, again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by typing into the box on the right-hand side where it says ask a question, and don't forget to press send. One question that did spring to mind, Derek, was what has the responses from the tobacco companies been to the index, indeed their willingness to comply?
Well, like everything, there's good and bad news. So I think if we go back to the I was privileged to be at PepsiCo during the start of the Access to Nutrition Index. And I recall well when we were asked at PepsiCo to complete the first version of the index, and the response internally was, why would we want to do that? That's not something we want to engage in. Once we heard that Coke was going to complete it, we completed it. And I think that people want to test first whether it's going to work. The same happened with the Medicines Access. There have been a number of multinationals who've been very open. There have been multiple meetings to check whether the data we put out is actually data that is verified against their own internal reports. There have been some who have not yet responded. The ones who have not responded tended to be those with the worst results and the state monopolies. Our goal is to redouble our efforts, to go back to the companies through the Euromonitor and sustainability groups and engage them, because part of this process is not one of penalizing and hitting people over the head. It's a process of understanding that companies are at different points in their starting part of this journey. We want to encourage them to use a common set of metrics, actually understand how they can and should make progress. And as they make progress, they will actually be able to do so profitably by lowering the health implications for people.
Perhaps for the benefit of those who arrived at the press conference slightly late, you said in your presentation that there'd been little progress. Perhaps you can just summarize for us, why has that been? Why has it been so little in your view?
I think there are many reasons. First, if you look at it from a company point of view, I think they are looking to deploy their capital to see where they actually are going to have ways of reaching markets. Now, if you've got a ban in place, very difficult, impossible to actually market a product. So there have been not just calls, but if you take the International Union of Tuberculosis and Lung Disease, called the Union, funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, they have put out a formal call to all low middle income countries to ban heated tobacco products and e-cigarettes in all of their jurisdictions. Many already have, and there are 35, 36 countries who've got some form of a ban or a severe restriction. That is a big impediment if you're trying to market and sell products in a country. Secondly, I would say that underlying that is a perception of whether these things are truly reduced risk. And for that, we require both better research, but better regulatory decisions. The recent decision by the FDA on both General Snus and on IQOS represents a step forward in actually giving clarity to whether these are truly lowering the exposures that one would want to limit in a population. We believe that those could have a cascading positive effect on other countries. Similarly, some of the approaches in the UK in actually being supportive of e-cigarettes being used as a tool to help people quit. We now know that the commonest way people quit smoking completely is by going through the route of e-cigarettes. And that is, again, an endorsement by a government. We're hoping, again, that'll have a cascading effect. But the public perception of the riskiness of nicotine, which is at the center of a lot of these products, remains very confused and has been confused by people in a lot of the media statements. And the confusion really is suggesting that nicotine may be a major cause of cancer, which it is absolutely not. Or it may be a cause of many of the bad things we worry about in cigarettes, which it is not. Countering that is proving to be much more difficult. And for that reason, one of the things that the foundation has done, and in fact today is the day we'll release it, is that we've started a new website called Understanding Nicotine. And I would recommend people look at the new website. If you just type in Understanding Nicotine, it'll take you there, to start seeing what we try to do, which is to correct some of these misconceptions, both the misconception that people may have as a consumer, those who may not be aware of the science, or those who may be unaware of the rich amount of patents filings going on to show that business, whether it's tobacco, pharmaceutical, biotech companies, are all looking to innovate using nicotine for positive reasons, not for negative reasons.
Okay, very good. Well, I'll invite journalists to submit questions if they'd like to do so. Again, using the Q&A box on the right-hand side, and don't forget to hit send. One here is, to what extent are consumers driving the change?
The proof is in the sales, and we are seeing tens of millions of consumers moving off their combustible products to reduced risk products. So we have work which will be reporting through a range of grantees looking at how fast people have moved from combustible cigarettes to, say, heated tobacco products in Japan and Korea, or to e-cigarettes across much of Europe and Canada, or to snus out of other more toxic smokeless products across Sweden, Norway, Iceland. To my mind, that is saying something which is at the heart of all of this. Consumer demand for something which is reduced risk wasn't there. This whole category wouldn't have a chance of succeeding. But not only is it there, but you can start seeing the passion and the drive behind the users of the products who, with their testimonials, will tell us that their life has got better, they're breathing better, they're more active, and their health risks have got better. We obviously have got to nail down what that means in purer epidemiological terms. But the response of the consumer is profoundly powerful and strong.
We have a consumer panel taking place in Asia time this week, which I know everyone will be joining in to see. But in talking to a lot of the guys who are taking part in that consumer panel, they all tell me that it's them who drove the change towards reduced risk products, not the governments and not the multinationals, but the consumers, and consumers are still the king. So you have to tune in and watch that panel.
No, and I think the consumers, and then there are the concerns about youth, and that is a big issue. I understand in the panel underway while we're speaking, one of the issues that Mitch Zeller has highlighted is exactly this question of the need to protect young people. And remember when Scott Gottlieb and him first laid out the vision of the transformation of the entire sector 3 years ago, the language was, we need to accelerate people into reduced risk and less harmful forms of nicotine. And in doing so, make sure that the on-ramp of young people did not increase in the process. Well, what happened over the ensuing years was that there was a kidification of the debate, and the focus moved almost entirely to a concern about kids. Some of that is probably starting to be corrected now. We now have the Youth 21 initiatives. We have companies introducing better means of age verification. We have a tightening down on some of the kidified flavors that hopefully will also have an impact. And my feeling is that if we can double down on addressing the issue of youth access far better, we'll be in a better position to accelerate the offering of reduced risk products to smokers, adult smokers, where the benefit will be profound. And I'd like to remind people that there is no other way to bring the death rates down in the next 10 to 20 years without addressing harm reduction and cessation in adults. It doesn't matter whether a single kid ever started or stopped smoking now to the long term. That affects the long-term mortality. It won't show up in statistics for 30, 40 years. What does show up in the short term in tobacco control is 10 to 20 years, is whether we can actually find means for adults to quit or reduce their risks over the next few years. And that is what our effort is on, because we believe that there's a moral and ethical imperative to act faster rather than waiting the 50 or 60 years for the benefit to kids to accrue.
If there are no further questions, maybe Derek, I don't know if you want to say a few words in summary, and then we'll close up.
I think all I'll say in summary is that when we think back to what we might say the unthinkable, it was a few years ago when President Xi of China was introduced to the fact that it was possible to get rid of the internal combustion engine by using technology disruption, electric cars, and a range of technologies. His response was to look at this and say, well, this could be good for China, and it could be good for the world. Let's do it. And started setting a date definite when the internal combustion engine would no longer be sold and be available. I think that the technological challenges of doing this on a cigarette are substantially easier. We have the technology, we have the capabilities, we have the consumers, we have the innovators, many of them are in this conference. What we're lacking is the political commitment to say, let's go ahead and do this to save the lives of millions of people. And to remind people, I start off reminding them that there's 7 to 8 million people who die every year. Those numbers roll off our lips so easily. Well, they shouldn't. That still represents by far the largest preventable cause of death and disease in the world. And if you think about the massive efforts and disruption we were willing to place the world economy through for COVID-19, which is obviously having a big impact, but is still a fraction of what tobacco is doing. Remember that the health status of people affected by tobacco going into the COVID-19 pandemic is the same or maybe slightly worse than that is emerging. Whatever happens, we have an obligation to address those health needs with far more rigor and urgency. And hopefully we learned from the pandemic what we can and should be doing together across the private and public sector could have a substantial impact.
Okay, well, Derek, thank you again. And it's lovely to see you back here at GTNF and taking part. I should just mention that you've also got the Foundation's virtual booth, which people can go and visit in the engagement area. We strongly recommend that you do that. And Derek, we hope you'll come back again soon in the not too distant future. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, and stay safe, and thanks.
Thank you.